but I must say that he'll still be quite pleased with...
And this is what you'll be buying, whether you eat in the restaurant or take it away.
This, yes, our big prize on this week.
Good evening. For several hours, there have been no official reports of new action in the South Atlantic. But it is not likely that Sunday will be a day of rest.
It's the 1980s, and the British Army is considered one of the most powerful, best equipped and modern armies in the world. However, there's one part of the army that seems somewhat outdated. At that moment they were still relying on the Lee Enfield as their main sniper rifle, which has been in use since World War I. Sure, it did get some upgrades over the years, but it was starting to show its age. And after the Falklands Wars of 1982, it seemed clear that it was time for something new. So in 1985, testing began for a new sniper rifle to replace the old Lee Enfield. Now many rifles were submitted and tested, rifles of well-established brands like Remington and Parker Hill, but at the end one stood out above all the rest, which was the rifle of Accuracy International, later named the L96A1. The army was absolutely in love with it, and Accuracy International got a contract to produce 1,212 of these top-of-the-line new sniper rifles. So yeah, that's great for the people at Accuracy International. But wait, who actually is Accuracy International? Well, you see, here's where we run a little bit into a problem. The company at this moment doesn't really exist and only consists of 3 guys. We have Dave Walsh and David Cage, 2 engineers who in the 1970s were making replicas of Colt revolvers in their garage. And later Malcolm Cooper, who was a competitive shooter at the time and would win 2 gold medals in 1984 at the Olympics. Over the last years, the 3 men have been busy designing, producing and perfecting their rifle, so when they had the chance to submit their rifle to the British Army for testing, they saw it as a great opportunity to lay it in front of some professionals and to get some professional feedback. The rifle was more meant for competitive shooting and hobbyists and not really something that the army would be looking for. So they really weren't expecting to win this contract. But now that they actually did win the military contract, they had a few options. They could come clean and admit that they wouldn't be able to deliver that amount of rifles on time, risking to lose the contract in the process. Or they could fake it till they make it. You can guess one time which option they chose. Now the only thing that they had to do was convince some inspectors from the army that they would be able to produce these rifles according to British standards. Just keep in mind, at that moment they were still building these rifles out of their garage. So at least one thing was sure, their current workspace would not pass. So they gathered some money and went out to rent a more professional looking industrial space. At least for a few days. So they grabbed all the tools that they had, all the stock that they had, the things that were finished and unfinished, and laid them around this industrial space, making sure to make it look as professional as possible. And now, the only thing that they had to do was convince the army that they were legit. The day comes, and a bunch of inspectors show up at the door of Accuracy International's top-of-the-line factory. Now Dave Walsh, David Cage and Malcolm Cooper drag these guys as fast as possible through this warehouse. They try to go through it as fast as possible, make it seem as professional as possible, like, oh yes, here's where we make the barrel, here's where we make the receiver, here's where we put it all together. Well, that's the end of the tour, gentlemen. I'm starving. You guys want to get some lunch?
Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
And somehow this worked, even though they were walking through a factory without any employees and with very little stock, they got an approval. In fact, during the lunch, the inspectors were complimenting the guys on their factory and saying to them, yeah, this was more of a formality to make sure that there are not a bunch of guys making these rifles in some garage or something like that. They produced 100 of these rifles before they got caught. And to be honest, the story should have ended there. The military should have probably picked something new and moved on. But that's not what happened, because the army really liked the L96A1, so they decided that another company would produce these rifles. And again, that's where the story should end. But it didn't, because the company that was going to produce these rifles was Pylon Industry, a company that was specialized in missiles and not in rifles. This was a big company at the time, and they really didn't have much interest in working together with a bunch of amateurs that were working in their garage.
How could you hope to lead us when you hardly know anything about what we do? I'm sure you mean well, but you must see that it's an impossible task.
So when Pylon did get the blueprints for the L96A1, they grabbed their best crayons and started to make improvements on the design that Accuracy International gave them. And let's just say that these improvements were not really for the better. This part looks quite hard to make, let's change it all up. All the measurements in the blueprints are in Imperial? Well, just change it up to metric system. Don't worry too much about it if it's a bit off, it's a rifle, what can go wrong? Using sophisticated machinery to mill this part? That will take a lot of time. We can better just cast it and be done with it a lot faster. You need a certain kind of steel for that? Well, I mean, that's just a suggestion, right? Suffice to say, the guys at Accuracy International were not really pleased with the quality delivered. And neither was the army. The rifle just didn't perform how they were expecting and would sometimes not fire or would even fire without pulling the trigger. But even worse, because of all of these design changes, sometimes a round could go off in the barrel when the bolt was not completely closed. And this would basically mean that the gun would shoot, well, both ways. And of course that is exactly what happened, and it severely wounded the British Marine, and the army immediately stopped using these rifles. Of course, when this happened, Pylon was all of a sudden a lot more willing to work together with the guys of Accuracy International.
Very well then. Open the door and let's return to the fold.
They came back and it took them around 6 weeks to find out all the mistakes that Pylon was making with their improved design and to basically clean up behind them and fix all of the rifles again. And after this whole fiasco, the blame was laid on Pylon for very good reasons, and shortly after they went bankrupt. At that point it was really clear for the guys at Accuracy International that the best way to ensure that the rifle would be made in their exact way, the way that they intended it to be, was to make it themselves. So Accuracy International as a company, they went out of their garage and actually got a proper workspace, and this time it was not just to fool the inspectors but to really make something. This was clearly the correct move, because after all of this drama was over, Accuracy International got multiple other contracts selling to different countries like Sweden, Australia, the US law enforcement, just to name a few. Till this day, Dave Walsh and David Cage still have an active role in Accuracy International. Sadly, Malcolm Cooper passed away in 2001. At the time of his passing, he won 2 gold medals in the Olympics, 7 gold medals at the Shooting World Championship, and 14 gold medals at the European Shooting Championships. And many of these medals were won using one of the rifles that was made by Accuracy International.